smartphones, and we're thinking about, like, because we are the parents of the clickers, and the clickers take a lot of care and feeding, and we're thinking, they're so much better than the pieces of paper that we used to use, and yet, ready for the next generation.
I miss the paper.
So, Tracy and I were laughing about that yesterday when
Yeah.
we were voting on so much, because back in the day, before the clickers, you used to write it down, take it out, count the ballots, come back in with a teller's report, vote again, go back out, count the ballots. So it took weeks. It was like voting for us. So the clickers were like magic, but now not so much like magic, because they're just a pain. They take the batteries out every single time, put all their batteries back in. People put them in their pockets, so we lose a few every single time we use them. And I know people get home and think, oh, this dreaded thing, and they put it someplace, and we have to buy a new one. So this is my hobby horse about why we use smartphones. This is not her total interest, although she is the one who puts the batteries in and out, so maybe that's more of a motivation than I realize. But we do know that when we walk into our classroom, our kids almost all have this with them. It's got a lot of power. What does your email say, Ben?
Sent from a device more computing power than Apollo 11.
Yeah, okay, so we know that it has more computing power than Apollo 11. And yet, we seem to fight against it more than we try to figure out how can we put that to use in the classroom. So, Bethany's done a lot of research on this, and she has some great ideas about how to take this force that students pay their own money for and bring with them of their own free will and can't be separated from, how we can turn that to our advantage rather than fighting against it, and how it may possibly replace our clickers, which would just be great. Bethany.
Thank you. Okay, so obviously talking about smartphones in the classroom, and my goal is that if any of you are still using clickers in your classroom, I will convince you that at least you should move beyond that.
Back to
So,
paper.
well, no, I don't want you to move in the other direction. We'll see. But so you all know that smartphones are a double-edged sword. So they can be used for good, they can be used for evil. To illustrate that, my sisters and I fundamentally disagree about the way in which you watch a movie. So this is true across the board. When I watch a movie, I always need a snack, and that's for fuel. Because I'm not one of those people that just sits and watches a movie. I talk through the entire movie. So it's sometimes hard finding people who will watch movies with me. Now, I don't talk about just random things, I'm not the kind of person like in the middle of the bridge blowing up. I'm like, so I went to the store and got some bread today. Like, no, I'm talking about the bridge. Like, what kind of supports do you think that bridge had that like it blew up with so little dynamite? And I talk consistently. I try not to talk when the characters are talking, but it gets a little iffy. My older sister is exactly the opposite. So she'll sit there and she doesn't say anything throughout the movie. She doesn't even respond to like the witty things that I say, which honestly, like, I don't know, that must take a lot of self-control for a multitude of reasons. But instead, she's usually sitting over there in her chair, like, And I don't know how she can see the movie. Well, she doesn't know how I can hear the movie, but I don't know how she sees the movie. The thing is, though, she's not paying attention. When I'm sitting here talking about how did that bridge blow up like that, she's like, oh, actually they had to like double the TNT in order to get the bridge to blow up because this was before special effects, because it was done in 1948, and here's a list of all the actors in it. So she's sitting there researching stuff on her phone. She knows more about the movie at the end of the movie than I do. On the other hand, I have my younger sister, and she's a lot like my older sister. She will also sit there like this on her phone throughout the movie. But there's a fundamental difference in what the older sister is doing and what the younger sister is doing. Because if you pause the movie while the older sister is looking down at her cell phone, she instantly looks up. Oh, did you want to know who that character was? Hang on, I'll find out what else they've been in. We've seen them in like 18 other movies. If you pause the movie while my youngest sister is watching it, it takes about 3 minutes for her to notice that the movie paused. And then she looks up and is like, what? So she's not paying at all attention to this. Now, there is a right way to watch a movie, and it's how I watch movies. But there's also other ways to watch movies. And the point is, even though two of my sisters are using their cell phones throughout the entire movie, one of them is probably using it for good, and the other not so much. So the trick is sort of, how do we evaluate whether we're using cell phones for good or not so much? And it won't come as any surprise for you to know, there's been a lot of research done on this. But if you've ever tried to actually look into the research on what cell phones are being used for in the classroom and whether it's for good or for evil, it starts to sound like this. It's just a flood of noise, just a cacophony. On the one hand, you have a professor who says, you know, I tried them in my linguistics class and students thought they were doing better on the tests, but it turned out they were doing much worse. Then on the other hand, you have a study that was done at Columbia University where they tried it on 400 freshmen and the scores went up. So you have conflicting evidence from both sides that cell phones are good, cell phones are bad, we need to ban them, we need to use them more, and it can be hard to sift through everything that there is out there. So I want you to know that I've done this for you. For this presentation, I sifted through over 100 research articles. Most of them were very boring. I researched case studies, which were mildly more interesting. And I spoke with instructors both here at Lee and at other schools. And what I was looking for was less a consensus on are they good or are they bad, and more emerging trends. And so it's not going to surprise you that there are trends. First, let's talk about trends for which you should not use your cell phone. Because one of the keys to understanding how you should do something is often understanding what you should not do something. And you know this just from teaching students. Often if you want to show them a good example, you'll also show them a bad example, because we learn more from what we do wrong than from what we do right. So the first thing you should not use cell phones for are tests. Anything that affects the student's grades in a huge way, probably not good to be using an electronic for it. There's numerous studies done that students engage different parts of their brain when they're writing things by hand versus taking notes on the computer. And especially if you're using cell phones in the same way that we use clickers, where they're just answering a question and then they're moving on to the next one, it can be hard for students to fully engage with that question before they're instantly moving on to the next thing. They've been programmed by cell phones that it's just sort of a quick thing they're doing on their smartphone and then moving on. So until further research can be done, until we can sort of find a good way to do that, we strongly suggest not using them for tests. Also, don't use them if you're uncomfortable with them. Now, caveat here, this doesn't mean if you hate cell phones, you never have to use them in the classroom. What it does mean is become comfortable with them before you get up in front of the class. And that's something that we can help you with at the CTE, obviously. The number one thing you should not use smartphones for in the class is the lesson focus. Okay, imagine you walk into the classroom and you've got a big whiteboard on the wall, and you turn to your students, you're really excited. We're going to use the whiteboard today. You can see the excitement on their faces, right? And you're like, not only the whiteboard, we're going to use the marker. And each of you is going to get to come up and write something on the board, and this is how we're going to generate discussion. Now, will you generate discussion? Yeah, probably. They're going to discuss something. But it's what you're discussing that they're going to remember, not the fact that you used the whiteboard. And ultimately, 5 years down the road, they're not going to remember if they used the whiteboard in that class or not. They're going to remember what it was you discussed. The other reason you really shouldn't make technology the lesson focus is sometimes it doesn't work. Okay? It's like walking in and saying, we're going to use the whiteboard and we're going to use the marker, but the marker doesn't work. How many of you have ever tried to write on a whiteboard and you start writing and it looks really promising? Then as you're going, the pen's slowly running out of ink and you're panicking, so you start picking shorter words, but it doesn't make it to the end. Okay, that happens with cell phones too. You could say, we're going to use this app and I've tested it 15 times, it should work. But one student has problems with it and suddenly every student has problems with it, and now it's gone, and what are you going to do in class? So it's okay to use them. It's good to use them. It's not good to make them the entire focus of the lesson, because the focus should always be on the learning. Remember, technology like smartphones is always the tool or the vehicle, not the end goal. Now, we've talked about things that trends say you shouldn't do. There are some positive trends that we see as well. And the number one we see in using smartphones in class is it increases student interactions. And you're thinking, yeah, well, duh. Of course, students want to interact with their cell phones. That's like all they do all day, ever. But I'm not just talking about interactions with their cell phones. David Dean is a professor who did a study in his British history class. And he was teaching it to largely Americans, and he realized they didn't really have any information on British history. They were and he was using clickers. And so he decided to use the clickers just to sort of see if they had done their reading. He would ask an initial question, and they just sort of answer it while he was talking. Then he realized the questions sometimes needed follow-up questions to clarify if they'd really done the reading. And what he found when he was doing the follow-up questions was that students were engaging more with the readings when they realized they had to do these follow-up questions. But beyond that, sometimes there were conflicting answers. So if he asked one question, he would get a variety of answers, and students who thought that something was clear-cut now realized that there was a variety of opinions on it. Then he would stop the class and they could have discussions. And he used these as a tool to engage them with the historian's craft, to teach them that history is not always clear-cut. This is how we know what we know. This is how we've reached these conclusions. And they became a better learning tool than just answering a question. So if you can do that with clickers, and you've all used clickers so you know how well they function. You talked about this has more power than Apollo 11. Imagine what we could be doing with this. So to make it simple, because there's so many things you can be doing with this smartphone, I've tried to break it down into some categories for you. But what I'm going to tell you first of all is that these categories are not comprehensive. So you've heard the saying, there's an app for that. Guys, it's true. Like, I looked into it. There's an app for that. There's an app for everything. The problem is, there's an app for everything. So sifting through them can sometimes become extremely overwhelming. So I'm going to give you some just general apps that we've found helpful, other people have found helpful. But what you need to be able to do is decide if it's helpful for you. Just because everyone else uses something in their classroom and they've had great results, doesn't mean it's going to have great results for you. So 3 quick things you should keep in mind when dealing with any sort of technology is first decide what you want to do and then how you're going to do it. Like we talked before, this is not the message. This is just the media. You're not going to sit here and say, I would like to use smartphones in my classroom. That's not going to help you. It's not going to help your students. And if you come to me with that question, it's certainly not going to help me figure out how you can best use smartphones. But if you come to me and say, I'd like to increase discussion in my classroom, how can we do that? Smartphones may be the answer. But the trick is, with the question, there's an app for that, you have to know what that is first. So until you know what you want to do, you can't decide how you're going to do it. So the first step is always figuring out what you want to do in the classroom before you decide on how you're going to do it. You should also consider how much time you have to devote to the activity. So if you've decided to use smartphones to increase discussion, you don't want to spend 10 minutes while everyone downloads an app if you're only going to use it once. That's not a great use of class time. You also don't want to have them sit there researching, 25-page papers on their smartphone in the middle of class time. That's probably also not a great use. But if you know you're going to be using this app throughout the course, it's going to add into all your lessons, taking 10 minutes from the first day of class when you're going over the syllabus is less of a sacrifice. So you have to decide how often you're going to use the activity, how you're going to use the activity, and how much time you actually have to devote to that. And then set expectations. Expect students to follow clearly established guidelines. Sometimes people will say, but if I tell them they can use their cell phone for this, they're going to be using their cell phone throughout the entire class. Or if I tell them I don't want them using their cell phones except for this, they're not going to bring them to class and then they won't have them. Lay down for students exactly how you want them to use the technology, and then expect them to follow that. Don't expect them to know that they can only use their smartphones at this time. Don't expect them to know that they should bring their smartphones to class. Tell them what you expect from them and then watch the students rise to your expectations. Once you've decided, hey, I think that I would like to use smartphones in my class, what are some things you can do with them? Discussion is probably the easiest way you can get started using smartphones in your classroom. Discussion generally is just a, you can ask questions. It's really easy for students to figure out how to engage with their smartphones. You can use it as a jumping point that doesn't take up too much class time. So, questions, very easy to embed in your PowerPoint. If any of you have your smartphone on you, go ahead and take it out right now. Now this is using Poll Everywhere, and I tried to pick a really inflammatory question. And I figured there's not much more controversial than Crocs. So basically, the way this works, just text Bethany Sarge 301 to this number right here. And then A or B as your as you feel led. And just so you know, there is no middle ground. You either love them or you hate them.
So is them the giver of the Crocs or the Crocs themselves? Or are we setting or what are we setting
Oh,
on fire?
the Crocs themselves.
Oh, okay.
If you want to set
I'm
the
not changing
giver
my
as
answer.
on fire as
Yeah.
well, I mean that's
Just-
fine. I understand.
For clarification.
For clarification, you want to set the shoes on fire, not the person who gave them. Maybe you never want to speak to that person again, but I mean, maybe don't set them on fire. There we go. We have someone who wears Crocs. Now I'll go ahead and tell you. Like I said, I tried to pick an inflammatory question. I actually own 3 pairs of Crocs, and I wear them frequently. They come in handy. I got stung by a wasp this summer, and my foot swelled up to about 4 times its normal size. You know what shoes were very comfortable and my foot could still fit in? Crocs, man. I wore them to work. They're very helpful. However, I will say that they're not always the classiest shoe. So maybe use them with discretion. If you wear them with socks, then you're getting into iffy territory. So I could have just asked you all, do you own a pair of Crocs, and how do you feel about them? The problem is, I've seen this in sessions before, where I'll say, how many of you own a pair of Crocs? And everyone just kind of looks at each other. And then you look at me, and then you look away because you're afraid to make eye contact. So eventually I end up calling on someone. It's probably Jordan here sitting in the front row. And I said, Jordan, do you own a pair of Crocs? Even though I know he doesn't. And he just shakes his head. Yeah, see? And so now I know that Jordan doesn't really like Crocs. So now I'm going to, okay, does someone else? And then I'll say, like Michael in the back, do you own a pair of Crocs? And now he's been picked on from the back. And everyone else is like, okay, they can only spend so much time on this. I'm not going to answer. And so out of an entire room, I've really only gotten the opinion of 2 people. And everyone else is just trying to play it safe, and they don't really have to weigh in. From this, you can see that most of you are pretty judgmental of people who wear Crocs. I mean, like, that's extreme, guys. Also, the really nice thing is I can now save this. So in case anyone asks me, what's a general feeling like of a sample size about how Lee University feels about Crocs? I say, it's a little hit or miss, but by and large, I wouldn't wear them at Lee. People may judge you for them. So this is, if you're asking questions in class, sometimes, you'll call on a student, and then you have that student's opinion. You could call in another student, you have that student's opinion. But you can really only take a very small sample size, and you'll notice students will start to sort of, well, I agree with what they said. And you hear a lot of that. Whereas if you have a question on the screen, they have to answer it before they really know what everyone else thinks. And you get a more accurate assessment of what they think. And again, you can save it. You can go back and look at it and say, okay, where did I fall? Maybe we need to review these things. So I'm using Poll Everywhere. And I really like Poll Everywhere because you can embed it directly into the PowerPoint, which makes it super helpful. And lots of other professors have used it at Lee. Have any of you ever heard of Poll Everywhere? Yeah, quite a few of you. It's really nice. There's got a lot of different options too. So it's not just multiple choice. You can have word clouds. You can have open-ended questions, clickable images, surveys. There's a lot of different options you can do with this to engage your students. It's helpful for asking students questions. You can start a discussion or a debate. You can have them identify the most important factors in a reading. And it doesn't always have to be a right or wrong answer. You can put up multiple themes and have them choose which did you feel was the predominant theme in this piece. They choose it, and you sort of see where the class is going. Did they all choose one? Why did someone choose a different one? Why is there a discrepancy here? You can use that as a discussion for the reading. You can generate word clouds for group discussion. I know Arlie Tagayuna does this in his classes. So he'll often have students text in words in response to an image or an idea that he's sharing. Sort of get a feel for the students' reactions to something. The nice thing about Poll Everywhere is there's no student account needed. So you can just text in like that. Very simple. As you see, it only takes a couple minutes of class time. The bad thing is the free account is limited to 40 responses. So for a lot of classes, that's probably okay. For classes like Arlie Tagayuna, he has 100 some odd students in his class. So if you do have a larger class, there are other options for you. Piazza is another one. Piazza can do open-ended questions as well as multiple choice questions. And this one has a lot more customization than Poll Everywhere. So even though the question variety is a little more limited, you have a lot more options for how you want it to display to students and to you. So like I said, you can have unlimited student accounts on Piazza. You can set it so it's anonymous for the students, but the instructor can actually see. So since they register for a student account, you can set it so you can see which students answered which way. But on the student's display, it's completely anonymous. So you're not broadcasting who got the question wrong, but you're able to look and see who's maybe missing that important knowledge. You can, like I said, there's a lot of different customizations. One that I really like is you can set it to automatically close. So if this is a thing that you've set up and you don't want to be bothered going in so students can't change their question or answers, you can set it to automatically close after a certain amount of minutes or at a certain time. The other really helpful things that apps can help you with are questions in class. You all know that when students ask questions, they're often engaged more. And I can tell by how many questions students are asking. And here, you guys are really with me, so well done. If you have a large classroom, though, it can be hard to get feedback from students because they're afraid to ask questions. So how many of you have ever heard of a back channel? Okay. So a back channel, basically, it's a Twitter feed, but you can set it to only display certain tweets. In this case, I've filtered just for the LeeU hashtag. So we've got a bunch of Lee news here. What you can do, though, is you can set a hashtag for your class. You can display this either just to the students or just for you. And students can weigh in directly on Twitter with questions they might have as the class is going. So if you have a large classroom and students are afraid you won't be able to hear them from the back, they're a little shy, they don't want to shout over the other students, this can be a way better way for them to sort of weigh in. They can all tweet in their responses. It allows students in large classrooms to ask questions. It can be moderated by other students or TAs. So let's say a student weighs in with a question. You might not even have to address that in the class. If they say, when did he say the homework was due? They use the hashtag. Other students in the class can weigh in as well because they'll also be able to see the questions. And like I said, you can display it to the class or you can just display it on your screen. So you're seeing the questions. You can say, okay, I see a lot of this question coming in. Let me address that point. Classroom Queue is another very helpful app. Basically, this is the student view. They just put in their name. They've got a large red panic button right in the middle of the screen. They can type a question if they like. And what it does when they click that, your screen looks almost identical to this, except where the large red button is, it says Q. And then you'll see the names of the students as they weigh in. And if they've supplied a question, you'll see the question as well. So it can provide an opportunity for shy students to easily get your attention. If you are one of those people who maybe moves around the classroom, they can hit the button, and then when you go back to the computer, you can see, oh yeah, they needed my help. You can wander over to help them. Students are also able to provide specific comments and questions. So you saw back in our example here, when is the homework due? They could ask something like, I need clarification on those dates, and put it in your queue. Now, the free account limits 5 students in the queue at a time. Unless you have probably about 100 students in your class, if you have more than 5 students waiting for help, you may want to go back and clarify some things. You can use apps for games. There's a lot of research done on gamification of the classroom. Students often engage with things better when they're having fun. So Socrative has been around for a long time. Side note, I always called it Socrative, but then I watched a video and apparently it's Socrative, you guys. So I've been pronouncing it wrong my whole life. But what Socrative does, it's pretty similar to things like Poll Everywhere or Piazza, and that you can ask the students questions. What it does, though, is it gamifies the whole experience. So while they're asking questions, answering the questions, you can set it to display which student is ahead. And you would be surprised how competitive students get when they realize they're playing a game and secretly learning. So while students take the quiz, results are displayed in race form. They don't even have to be spaceships. There's like 60 different options. You can have them swimming, you can have like old-timey motorbikes, I don't really know. There's a whole bunch of stuff on there. But this can be also used to start discussion or just to test knowledge. You want to know where your students are at? Have them play a game. They're having fun. You're finding out where the gaps are that they need to know before the next test. It allows you to save the results. So you can go back and maybe review these and see where students have missed things, maybe where you've missed things. Kahoot is another one that's designed specifically to sort of gamify the whole experience. It allows you to create quizzes, discussions, surveys, and Jumble, which is a brand new game for the last 2 years. With Kahoot, students compete in a variety of games. There are time limits in music, which sort of set it up like a game show. So it feels more like Jeopardy because you've got this music ticking, you've got the big clock there that's counting down, and students get very competitive about beating the clock. The nice thing about this is also there's many pre-built games, so you don't always have to go in and create your own set of questions. You can look and see what other people have done and maybe pull those resources for yourself. Kahoot works really simply. Your screen looks like this. On their screen, they'll put the pin in and they join your game. Once the game is started, again, on your screen, you'll have the question, and then on their screen, they're just dragging and dropping answers. This is an example of a jumble. As you can see, the student correctly rated maple syrup as the worst food. So they're getting 100 points. The correct answer for the highest, by the way, would be cupcakes, obviously. The biggest way, though, that we talked about is just sort of student interaction. Get students more engaged with the classroom. And there's a wide variety of ways you can do this. The first of which is Google. What do you do when you want to know something? What do you do when you want to show someone something? What do you do when you want to share an example of something? I Google it. My nieces and nephews Google it on my phone, and they're all under 6. One of the best ways to use Google is just a scavenger hunt. So let's say you're talking about fake news. Have students pull up examples of fake news. Have this side of the classroom pull up examples of fake news, and this side pull up examples of real news. Then have them compare it. It's a great way for students to actually demonstrate their knowledge, rather than just reciting fake news will have the properties of. Can they actually identify fake news on the web if they find it? Have them pull up examples of Dadaism. You're talking about Dadaism, see if they understand the concept. Can they actually show you an example of that without just Googling Dadaism? Use it to identify definitions. So, what does Juliet say, wherefore art thou Romeo? For the non-literary people, by the way, she's not looking for him, he's not lost. Identify quotes. There's a lot of misinformation on the internet. See if they can track down the actual source of things. So the quote, "Elementary, my dear Watson," side note, does not come from any Sherlock Holmes novel. It actually comes from a Woodhouse novel. You can use Google Maps. So Google Maps is another significantly underutilized resource. Have them identify locations based on geography. Rather than just saying, can you show me an example of a rainforest? Tell them some properties and then see if they can locate it on a map. See if they can locate the geography that they're looking for. You can prepare for cross-cultural trips by walking cities. Google Maps has come a long way since I was an undergraduate student. So in 2010, there was a thing as Google Maps, but you didn't have the street view. So I went to Oxford for a semester, and my friend and I decided we would go to London. We had never been to London before, so we did the responsible thing. We printed off a Google Maps sheet. And I was going to go one place, she was going to go to another. We were going to meet up at a theater at the end. What we didn't know was, since we had printed these directions separately, both maps took us to two different theaters, neither of which was the theater we were actually supposed to meet at. So at about 11 o'clock at night in London, we were desperately trying to find the theater where we were meeting each other, but also trying to find each other. I don't know if you've ever been to London, but it's big. We got very lost. I ended up having to ask what I hoped was a nice man for directions, and he led me underneath a parking garage, and it was just me and him, and I thought, this is how I die. If I had actually been able to pull up Google Maps on my phone and just kind of walked through the city, I probably could have avoided that. You could take students on virtual field trips. We'd all like to be able to pack students in somewhere and take them, across the globe, but you can't always do that. There's funding, there's time constraints. You don't really want to spend that much time with your students on an airplane. So for example, this is a picture of the theater in Pompeii. So this is one of the oldest Roman amphitheaters we have intact. This is an example of the amphitheater on Google Maps. So if you're using arts and culture, rather than just seeing an overview, you can actually walk around it. You get a much better feel of how large this thing really is. So we walk inside here. You see, it's a much different experience than just looking at an aerial picture of it. You're able to sort of stand inside it and see how much it's dilapidated. It's not just Roman art that you can do this with, or ancient culture. You can walk through museums on Google Map. You can walk through current cities. You can walk inside stores in California. I walked through a random dollar store in California because I could. There are so many instances. So if you're going on a cross-cultural trip, take advantage of that. Have students walk around. If you're talking about an area, have students take advantage of that. Walk them through on their phones. Back channels. We already talked about the Twitter back channel, but there's other back channels that you can use just to get students talking about things. So things like backchannelchat.com or Today's Meet, they're essentially just chat rooms for those of you who remember the 90s chat rooms. But they're just for your class. So you'll go to a specific URL or you'll put in a password, and you can just set up a chat just for your classroom. Now, chats can be used in a variety of ways. When I was a student, we did character interactions a lot when we were reading literature. And so I don't really advise this because as an introvert, I didn't really want to get up there and, well, I think that the character would say this. Maybe if I could have texted, it would have been easier. But you can do character interactions, debate, rather than having each student weigh in, maybe divide them into teams and have a spokesperson. And then you have a record of the debate rather than just having them weigh in side by side. And I'll tell you what, sometimes when students are writing things out, even if it's just texting on their phone, they're more articulate than they would be if they're just sort of back and forth with other peers. You can run a news feed. So we talked about the Twitter back channel. One thing that you can do is find a hashtag that's relevant. You can follow a person. There's a certain president who likes to tweet a lot. Maybe have that running in the background of your class. And you can follow news events in real time. So students are able to engage with that. You can discuss it while the class is going. You can use apps for collaborations. They don't always have to be done just by the student just on their cell phone. So Google Docs, you're all familiar with Google Docs. Google Docs is a great app for collaboration. It allows students to contribute in real time to a piece of writing. You can put up a piece of writing that they're currently reading and comment in class. So maybe put up a section from Oscar Wilde and I ask them to identify the themes. Put up a research paper and have them highlight theses. Padlet. Padlet is another great resource. So basically, Padlet is just a bulletin board that you can have in the front of your classroom, but students can find examples on their phone and post them right on Padlet. You can see in this case, they'll all just appear. You can add videos, you can add pictures, you can add text. So whatever the student's working on, they're able to add it and you can have a collection in the front of the classroom. So that would work in conjecture basically with the scavenger hunts on Google that we were talking about. Mine is, by the way, a collection of reasons that butterflies are no good, and they're not. You can use it to create a timeline. So maybe you're in a history course and you want to see if they really understand the events leading up to World War II. Ask them to recap those. They can drag and organize them. You know, someone puts in a battle and another student says, that really didn't happen until after this thing. And so they drag and shift and create a timeline there for everyone to see. Like I said, we can share examples. Storyboarding is another great use for it if you do that in your classroom. Event and project management. If students are putting on an event where they need to work together on a significant project, have them collaborate on that right in an app like Padlet, where they can all add what they're going to do. They can add screenshots of what they're working on, and they can talk to each other right there. You can also do peer review using your smartphones. So some examples of peer review that we've already talked about are Google Docs. Poll Everywhere allows you to put up pictures. Students can rate them if you were, like an art professor. Google Docs, by the way, I would have loved to use that in school because whenever we had to do a peer review of papers, they printed off 18 copies of papers. And so you see the professor walk in with a stack of papers about this big and you just felt sorry for the trees. You can use Pathbright, portfolios and showcases. You all thought you were going to get out of here without me talking about Pathbright. Students can put together portfolios of their work and share them with each other, and other students can comment on that. PeerGrade is a great app. It allows students to upload their work directly into here, and then it automatically assigns the student work to another student, allowing them to rate it using a rubric that you supply. And you can easily see how they're doing as they're going along. But there's so many more apps. We went through all of those really fast. The problem is, though, that I can only offer suggestions, and some of those may work for your class, but for a lot of you, there was a lot of stuff there that you're never going to use. We talked earlier about the idea that you need to do what works for your class, and you need to sit down and decide what works for your class before you do something. So while I can offer suggestions, until you know what you want to do in your class, all I can do is offer very generic suggestions. So actually, for the last about 20 minutes of the session, I'd really just like to have a discussion. So have you ever used cell phones in your classroom? Have you ever tried using maybe laptops for this sort of thing? Have you thought about using smartphones in your classroom? What are your fears about doing that? And what are your hopes that you would achieve by doing that? So has anyone ever tried using smartphones in their classroom? And what sort of results did you get?
I had students do it for research, and so if there were terms that were being used in the lecture that they weren't familiar with, just you can see their eyes glaze over, but they're all scared to ask, and so, okay, go look up that term, figure out what it means. And that seems to work pretty well, but it works better with less students in the class. And so if there are more students, it really falls apart, because half of them go do research and the other half check Twitter feeds that aren't related to class or other things.
So yeah, definitely the class size would determine how you would be able to use the smartphone. And like you said, that's a great idea, but the larger the class, probably they know that someone else is going to cover the research and they can just kind of drift off. Did you say you had used them as well?
In the middle school classroom, yes,
Mhm.
I did I used Kahoot quite a bit.
Okay.
Students really enjoyed games. So.
Yeah, and we tend to think, college students are kind of past that, but it's amazing how competitive they get and how excited they get by just like this chance to test their knowledge. And when you're using games, it probably works better to reinforce basic concepts. So you don't want to use a quiz where you're saying, identify 3 main sources for, World War I and explain each one. You don't want to have them sit there typing it out. But very basic concepts like what year did this occur, what's the definition of this, that sort of thing can really hammer those things home, I think. Yeah.
To confirm what you said, last July in an EDS class, I was introducing Kahoots, kind of in the same way you are. And the students wanted to create games to play the next day.
Yeah. So
And
they
called
started.
They called it games to play, but it was really they were checking on each other's knowledge.
Yeah, and the best way to demonstrate that you know something is to try to teach it to someone else. So that's a great way to reinforce knowledge, is just to have them making their own games.
And they were very competitive. These were the teachers for 10, 15 years.
Mhm.
So, hey, you're right, games doesn't matter.
So, completely different direction. Have any of you ever banned smartphones in your classroom?
Yeah.
Do you find that students were respectful of that? Did you find that they were sort of maybe a little frustrated by that?
Always sneaks.
Always sneak them. Do you think that it would have helped to maybe try to incorporate it at all?
After this lecture, I can certainly see some possibilities, for sure, but yeah. But again, a large class, like we do
Yeah.
little perspectives with 100
Mhm.
people, and we just ban it. And I try to pick some people and ask them to leave if they don't put it up.
Mm-hmm.
And they're very resistant to it. But after a while, because they have theirs out, we have quizzes, I'm trying to focus them on videos, a lot of activities going on in there, and but it's really hard to get the travel guides, the teaching assistants to rat on the students in their group too.
Right.
I
Well,
have to
they've
do it
been
all.
that student in the
Yeah,
classroom
'cause they've
using
been
their
that student in the
smartphone.
classroom,
So.
right. But you can tell pretty much when they're on.
Mm-hmm.
There are always at least 2 or 3 students in every class that are totally addicted, that just
Mhm.
cannot keep their eyes off of it, period. And those are the ones that are really frustrating.
Yeah. And so one of the things about, if you say, now we're going to take out our smartphones and use this, like you said, sometimes students will just do whatever they want. And so that's something you have to consider, is how much time do I have to ensure that they're actually doing this? But like you said, you're always going to have that student who's just doing whatever they want anyway. And so that can be frustrating too, if you feel like you're allowing them an avenue for this. So it's really, and what you'll find is that if you try any of these, it may work really well for one class, and it doesn't work at all for another class. Even if the classes are very similar, even if it's the same class but different students. So I think it's something that you have to use your wisdom in deciding, are we going to be able to do this? How can we do this? And the rules have to fluctuate depending on the students and how engaged they are with the content.
Just a shout out for clickers. I mean, when you don't have you don't have the question on the PowerPoint, they can't use it, right? I mean, there's nothing there to. So, we did it with time of faculty meeting where we were handed out clickers to vote, but nobody ever said, okay, we're going to take a vote now.
Right.
So you had the clicker the whole time. But again, the phone you can use for a lot of different things.
Mm-hmm.
With the clicker you can't.
Yeah, it's like I said, it's definitely a double-edged sword. I think that one of the things that we have to do that's probably not necessarily covered under here is model for them good behavior. If we can sort of, and this will start, in elementary school, middle school, high school, their habits are pretty ingrained as to how they're going to be using this in the classroom. But if we can model for them, there's a time to use this, and it can be used for good research, it can be used to enhance your learning, and if we can try to teach them that, it may help in further classes down the road.
Just
Were they-
FYI, don't
Yeah.
stand in the back in a faculty meeting and expect people to model.
Okay, this is a very loaded question. The very first thing you said is don't use it for exams.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, this semester, they're using it for evaluations.
Mm-hmm.
If I was a young faculty member, so what's your, I mean, are those two things, I see them as the same kind of basket. So you're doing evaluations,
Mm-hmm.
but you're not doing it for exam, I'm an old guy. Is there any connection between those two? Why are you saying not exams?
Well, the research that I've done, and this is why I caution against using them for exams or anything that contributes significantly to their grade. The research seems to indicate that students will feel they're doing better using some piece of technology. But because of the way they generally treat their cell phones, which is, I'm going to get on and I'm going to check Facebook and then I'm going to get off immediately, they're not fully engaging with that process. And so they may not be really considering the questions when they're answering them, despite feeling that they're being really efficient about it. And that's just the trends that it seems to
So
be.
if you were a young
It's-
faculty member at
Mhm.
Lee, would you be in favor of doing evaluations by cell phones?
I personally would not, no.
Thank you.
I wouldn't think that students are giving thoughtful
I wouldn't
feedback.
think so either.
But
Well, I've done it. I did it last semester. We
Mhm.
had the first option to do it.
Mhm.
And I really got more complete written responses than I've
Great.
ever gotten. But, and I really found that there was almost no difference between the
Yeah.
written and the,
and this could be a trend
Electronic.
too. You have to remember that students
once in a
now as well are not as used to handwriting things. So they may, when they write things out, they've written a sentence or two and they're like, oh my word, my hand is cramping. Like, and so they're disinclined to write, or they write slower than they text. So they may be disinclined to write long thought out responses because it takes so much work to write a sentence or two by hand. So they may be inclined to write more on their cell phones. This is something where, 5 years ago, this technology wasn't available. You all know how long it takes research articles to get published. So even though they're doing research on that sort of thing, it's not always available, and there's not a big consensus on how is this being done, and how is it changing, because the technology is changing so fast.
I think too with tests, it depends on what tool you were using to test.
Mm-hmm.
If it's a timed test, students that struggle would probably feel stressed and not do as well.
Mhm.
If it's self-paced,
That's true,
then,
definitely,
then they might feel more comfortable and give a better response.
definitely.
I also adjunct at Covenant,
Mm-hmm.
and all the evaluations are done online, everything, and it seems to work fine.
Now, I will say that when I was a student, we did all of our evaluations online. I didn't go to Lee for my undergrad, spoiler alert. But all of our evaluations were done online. I did them on my laptop, and it's probably just because I'm more comfortable typing on my laptop. Students now are definitely more familiar with the smartphone than they are with the computer, so they're probably more comfortable with it. So again, it's very hard to keep up with. You have to take so many different factors into consideration.
So are they texting the answers in the class?
it's in the class. It takes place in the class just like it always has, but they're just doing it on their phones rather than doing it on a piece of paper.
Because the different schools do it different ways, right? I think at Georgia State, they have to do it before they can see their grade or before
Yeah.
their grades
Yeah,
are
I've heard
posted or
that.
something.
Yeah.
Mhm.
They go
So
on.
this is actually, at least for the piloting of it, they're
Yeah.
doing it.
in the
It's
class.
just like normal. I mean, somebody shows up in the class, not the teacher, and
Yeah.
gives them a code to get into the evaluation, and then they do it.
So for those of you who have used smartphones in your classroom or who have tried to any extent, is there any advice that you would give other faculty members?
I did try Poll Everywhere in terms of putting up an image and having them find the focal point, essentially what's
Mhm.
the central primary point of focus on the image, and they would click it and it popped up on the screen, and that was very nice, but it took a long time to get everybody signed up and logged in
Mhm.
as was necessary. So what I took away from that is I should probably plan this more meticulously from the beginning and do, like you said, have them sign up at the beginning of the semester and intend to use it regularly. Because
Mhm.
if I try and experiment with them, I might end up wasting class time.
Yeah, definitely.
I had a similar experience with Piazza. I've been using it for 3 years, and now I have them sign up outside of class,
Mm-hmm.
following a handed printed out instructions, and that seems to work.
Yeah.
So there's no class time taken.
Yeah, that's definitely a good. Any class time you can preserve is always a plus.
I'm such an expert here. I had them use it to do research,
Mm-hmm.
but I think it was successful because they worked in pairs.
Mm-hmm.
They left to their own devices, they'll do whatever they want to with their cell phone.
Mhm.
If they're working in a group or in a pair, they're at least semi-accountable to another
Mhm.
person. It was funny though because it was kind of the grand conclusion of a short unit on history of the English language. So we were to the 20th century, and so I said, "Oh, you guys know the 20th century?" And they said, "Yeah, we were actually 3 at the end of the 20th century." Oh yeah, so maybe you don't know very much about this. So, but I gave them dates and asked them to find something that happened on that date that would have impacted the English language, the development of the English language, that hadn't worked together.
Yeah, and that's true. Two students who would be likely to get on Facebook by themselves, if put together, won't want to be the one that gets on Facebook first. So they'll be able to hold each other accountable. So that's a great suggestion, I think.
I see the whole thing as a cultural problem myself,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and I see it as a great sign of disrespect in a classroom when a student sits there the entire time like
Mhm.
this.
On that note, I've seen some research that says when people, particularly people in their 20s, can't see their phone, their anxiety level is very high. But explain this, there's also great anxiety when they can see their phone.
Right.
So, you know, go figure.
And it's just
Maybe we need to like put it in their pocket so they can feel it, but they can't see it. I don't know. Where's the happy medium there?
Well, the conclusion is phones cause anxiety.
Yeah. And I mean, you can sit there and debate. We didn't even touch on the debate. Are cell phones good for people? Should we be using smartphones at all? That's a whole separate thing. You can talk to Luis Almeida about that one. He has a rap that goes with it, so I strongly recommend talking to him about it.
Make
Actually,
sure you've got time though.
yeah, he does wax eloquent on it.
But I have an opinion.
Yeah.
I am not good at using the cell phone. I'm always, the last to get something done. But I always think that we teach better when we use the strengths that students bring to the class, when we build on their knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what they know. So it seems like banning it is to our own detriment.
Yeah, students are very comfortable with it, and if you can take advantage of that, you're going to find that they're able to do things you had no idea that they could do, and they'll be able to bring those strengths into the classroom. So I think that's a great way to put it, is just to harness their strengths. And I mean, honestly, students being sitting there on their cell phones, it's not an entirely different debate than, you could say that student is always reading in the class, and I know they're reading Harry Potter, that has nothing to do with the class. But you're not going to say, we're not ever going to use books in this classroom. Maybe you tell them that books are not appropriate at this time, but at some point you want them to look up something in the textbook, or they should limit it just to the textbook. And I think that the more time we spend actually encouraging them to use it correctly, the more likely they'll be to use it correctly. It's one of those things where the longer you put it off, the more exasperated we're going to be, because they're not going away. It's not one of those where you can just sort of ride it out, and then maybe in 5 or 10 years people won't have smartphones anymore. But in 5 or 10 years they may not have smartphones, but they'll probably just be wired into their ear directly. They'll have this little thing that comes down over their eye. Yeah, they're smartwatches. They'll be holograms. You guys, I'm really waiting for holograms. I can't tell you how much I want holograms. I'm gonna be able to tap my watch and have this little globe come up.
You sound like
Just
that.
tap it. I did. Well, I've been waiting for this for a decade now, since Iron Man. He had holograms. Where's my holograms? But there's always going to be some sort of distraction, and if we're not working on using that to our advantage, it's going to be used to our disadvantage. It's one of those where it's one or the other.
When I have a class that's 90 minutes long, which seems long to students, I guess, I sometimes say, okay, look, you seem to be an advocate here for using cell phones. would you like to be the person that halfway through the class says, let's take a cell phone break?
Mhm.
And then they can jack around with the phone. And also have another class where we have presentations. And I said, okay, between presentations, you can look at your phone. Trying to deal with that anxiety biz, you
Mhm.
know, and that works pretty well.
Yeah.
And when I say, okay, you know, 3 minutes is up or 2 minutes is up, whatever,
Mhm.
you know, generally they stop. But it
Yep.
does kind of, I mean, who knows what the heck they're got to know, and you can't wait. You can't wait 90 minutes.
Mhm.
You got to know now. But it's helpful.
Yeah. So maybe, you know, encouraging them to take some time and just, you know, okay, take 5 minutes out of a 90-minute class and just mess around, do whatever you want. And then when you come back, have an answer to these questions. And
Oh,
so
that'd be-
they can
that'd
sit
be
there on Facebook,
more
you know,
fruitful.
for a couple minutes and scroll through. It doesn't take that many minutes to identify how many likes you got on your most recent post. And then when they come back, you know, they've also spent that time productively. So. Well, I think that's pretty much all. I don't want to keep you guys here too late, but I appreciate you all coming.